So as I said, I started as a middle school teacher, and I came to that through an education policy background at the University of Pennsylvania, which was an interesting lens through which to view my teaching experience. And one of the interesting experiences that I had while I was teaching in Baltimore City was that my tenure there coincided with Baltimore's move to student-based budgeting. And one school had one-to-one iPads, they had trips to the opera and local zoos and farms, they had rooms full of reading resources and all the copy paper that teachers wanted. They sent their teachers to South by Southwest and ISD, and they brought in ponies from a local farm, which the kids could purchase pony packages on with their incentive dollars. And they also trained seeing eye dogs, so they had a literal dog and pony show. And unfortunately, that is not the school where I worked. I worked at a school just a mile away that did not have any paper. We ran out in October. We also didn't have textbooks or library books, which is a real challenge when you teach humanities. And we didn't have any of those things like field trips or professional development conferences or any of the things that make teaching and learning really exciting. And I couldn't understand this because these two schools had the same funding level. They had almost identical student populations and almost identical levels of funding. And when I looked closer at it, I realized that those principals were making very different resource allocation decisions that resulted in very different teaching and learning outcomes. And so I became completely obsessed with education finance and resource allocation, and have now devoted my life to empowering school and district leaders to make the best decisions that they can around resources, given the resources that they have at their school. So some of the finance challenges that we see in the industry across the country, which I'm sure many of you are dealing with, at least one of these in your district. Rising costs, pension costs, the ever-increasing cost of salaries, programs, field trips, you name it, it's cost more every year, right? It's always going up. And then we compound that with the fact that a lot of states are continuing to decrease their state funds. We're seeing that in most states they're funding at pre-recession levels. To add insult to injury, there's weak financial controls that result in a lot of mistakes that can really hurt districts on an audit or otherwise hurt their budgets. And on top of that, we have to think about these equity issues. So the example that I gave earlier is one example of that, but in many cases we're actually seeing that our high-risk, high-need students are not being funded at adequate levels to educate them. And in addition to all of this, you are getting yelled at by the board and the press and the parents and the teachers because they want to know where all this money is going, because they're absolutely sure that you have more money than you could possibly know what to do with, and they're not seeing any of it. And when you do get it, it looks like this. Yeah, it looks familiar, right? So I don't know about you guys, but I was not blessed with Rain Man-like capabilities to make any sense of this. I know Brett probably is, but most of us, this does not make a whole lot of sense. Numbers like this are awesome for computers, but not awesome for human brains. There's a reason why phone numbers are only 7 digits. So I imagine that a lot of you in this room that are embarking on move to student-based budgeting, or possibly in the early stages of it, feel like you're sort of at the base of Everest here, right? And you're just looking up at this giant challenge in front of you because your school leaders don't know where their money is, and yet you're trying to hold them accountable for it. And how are you ever going to get to this point where you can go to your board or your parents or your teachers and your community and say, this is what we know works. We know that we're using every dollar to optimal effectiveness. So we like to call this resource allocation mountain. where the bottom of the mountain is where no one knows where their dollars are or how best to spend them. And the top of the mountain is a magical place where we know how best to spend dollars to improve student outcomes. And at Allovue, we try to take you up that mountain one step at a time with all of the financial leaders in your district. And that starts with knowing how much money is in your accounts if you're a financial decision maker. I know probably everybody in this room has the basic luxury of an online banking system. And it doesn't sound like much, but it would be a lot more complicated to manage your personal finances without that quick reference. And then on top of that, then we can, once we've laid that foundation, we can start looking at whether or not our spending is compliant with guidelines. And then we can have more strategic conversations. Is our spending efficient? And then we can really start analyzing this at a macro level across districts to say, is our spending producing outcomes? And again, if I have any former teachers in the room, you might notice that this follows the Bloom's taxonomy, which is how you know what my background was. So our goal is to put education finance in balance. And balance is the name of our financial platform. And it does not replace your financial systems, it sits on top of it. And the goal is to provide decision makers across your district with a quick and easy way to visualize and analyze your financial data and have it side by side with your academic and non-financial data so that you can start looking for those relationships. So we like to call this Ed FinTech. And this is a combination of the information silos of education, finance, and technology. Probably all of you already have some FinTech in your district. That's your PeopleSoft, your Oracle, your IBM, Tyler Tech, whatever your back-end ERP system is. I'm sorry to tell you that most of the people at Oracle are not sitting around putting their heads together about how they can help principals improve student outcomes. That's where we come in. We combine our experience in education, finance, and technology to bring the power of that technology with the power of design to make it actually relevant to people who are making decisions for kids. And so that's why we call the intersection of these three areas Ed FinTech. I'm going to bring up my colleague Jason Becker now, who's our Chief Product Officer, and he's going to talk about how this actually works.
So thank you for the after lunch slot. I like to put that as a vote of confidence. It means that they are believe that we've got something worth saying that'll keep you up after lunch. I can tell you this is the most exciting thing I've worked on. Because in my past, I was an organic chemist, so I'm very good at drawing various geometric shapes, sugar molecules, and 109-degree angles. Like, I'm the boss of that. But eventually decided that wasn't what I wanted to do. Found my way to Rhode Island Department of Education, where I was a research specialist, and I did a lot of work with technology integration, program evaluation, predictive analytics, accountability systems, and all that kind of work. Then I worked at the Harvard Strategic Data Project, where I was placed in Providence Public Schools, and I was working primarily on developing early warning systems. But the real passion I have is actually the very first project I worked on at the Department of Education, which was revamping a funding formula to be more student-based in Rhode Island. We were in the Pennsylvania situation where for 15 years we were just level funding or increasing funding by, say, 3% a year, coming up with whatever numbers we wanted in a political process to dole out state dollars. And so the first project I worked on was saying, you know, in 15 years it's been enough. Some of these districts have lost tons of students, some have gained more, and there was no recognition of need. And so that project, coupled with the move towards a uniform chart of accounts, which is very similar to the work that's going on now in Colorado for that school-based budgeting and the need for that transparency, Rhode Island embarked on this in 2009 and 2010, where we were going to require account-level reporting to the school in the same system with all the same structures for every school district and school in the state. And so my job was to take that information and do something with all the academic information that we had and putting it together with this new source. So that's how I ended up here at Allovue, because I am acutely aware of the challenge that faces the folks who are not the CFOs and the budget analysts. They're sitting there and they're getting this new responsibility. How am I supposed to manage a $4 million, $6 million budget in a lot of these schools? That's not my training. right? My training is as an educator in most cases. I know classroom management. I know pedagogy. And the first step is they've got to get their data. And we make them do things like this, maybe. Writing SQL queries or SQR. Or if we're lucky, we might have some custom proprietary interface where I have to learn various terminology and I have to drag and drop different fields and build out these reports in our system. And they're very complicated, they're very old style systems. And worse than the complicated interface to produce these things is that they require a lot of knowledge. So most of these BI tools, business intelligence, most of these querying tools, you've got to know something about the structure of the data in models that are a little bit prettier than this, but not much. And that's not what these folks are trained to do. And you shouldn't have to know this in order to do financial analysis and to learn about where your dollars are and whether or not they're effective. And they certainly will have to learn about something that looks like this, which is a snippet of a chart of accounts manual somewhere. So once I get over the fact that I've got to learn how these tables are structured, where I'm looking for different fields, what fields to put together, and do all this complicated work, I've got to understand this very complicated logical model of my data, which is how do we describe what spending is in this account. And it takes this key to make sense of things. And so this is what happens. They don't use those tools. They're not getting that data and using that stuff. What happens is they call somebody. And it takes a lot of time and people support to make this happen. And we do these rollouts over the course of 3 or 4 years, right, in order to build training and build understanding, which is a great practice. Or we have to give 4 or 5 different financial roles that add up to almost a full FTE in order to give constant support. A lot of which is getting data into and out of those systems and then describing what it is that you get. So we make the call. And we end up having to talk to people in order to manage this. That's very challenging, you know. It's hard to get the data, it's hard to understand the data. Now we're putting the role and responsibility and accountability on them. We've got to back that up with the tools and the supports that are necessary. And when that doesn't happen, it means that the phone just rings off the hook. And in fact, even without that level of responsibility, most folks in the room, even pre-student-based budgeting, I bet that they are already getting the phone off the hook. And when they get the data, it looks like this, right? And you've got to know how to manipulate this data. You've got to know how to do pivot tables or VLOOKUPs and left and splitting cells across, and then you have to know how to do subtotaling and all this complicated stuff just to get to what you want to do. Again, this is not what we need principals to spend their time on when they're trying to figure out whether or not they can schedule a field trip next month or when they expect to run out of paper dollars. When you're lucky, you might get a report that looks like this, that has some natural language and has some words and descriptions, but this is the standard. Once you've gone through those efforts of dragging and dropping things, once you've gone through that result, that's what you end up with. And so the set of skills that we expect for folks to have, and again, we're not analyzing finance at this point. We are still just getting your data out and playing with it, right? A huge set of skills that are not the training, the expectation, or the time commitment that we expect principals to make before we get up to the part where we start holding them accountable for student achievement and student outcomes and making good resourcing decisions in order to lead to those things. We haven't even gotten up to that part where we bring all those dollars down and we figure out how is this impacting student outcomes? Where are my operational outcomes that are being driven by my resourcing decisions? And so that's the part that we try to cut out. And I think that the elements of a successful program, when it comes to providing greater autonomy and greater distribution of leadership and decision making, I think they're pretty straightforward, right? You should only have to have basic knowledge of web applications. We always talk about how it's so much easier for me to understand my Starbucks habit with my credit card account or something like Mint.com than it is for most principals to understand their spending data, and that doesn't make any sense. You shouldn't have to have a ton of financial or data analysis expertise to get value, but there can be a gentle ramp up in order to do the most complicated things. But just to get your data, you shouldn't have to go through all those steps. It should be a gentle ramp that you can bring someone up. You need to have a system that has self-service, You can't be picking up the phone all the time for the basic questions, and then you need to back up the supports on the more complicated work. This is sort of that ramp up, right? So we need folks to be able to get their own information quickly and easily, have a base level understanding, and the supports have to come in more on the strategy side. That's what the professionals should be doing. We call these folks budget analysts, financial analysts. They don't do analysis most of the time. They're just getting data in and out of the system. That's not analysis. What we want is to, in order to empower districts to do analysis and take the rest of that and put it on the folks in the buildings by giving them the right tools and supports. That's not a big deal. It should be visually appealing. It should be joyful. You should get insights, and it should be fast. All right? Understanding where my money is not something that should take 3 hours in a product. It should be something I can check over my morning coffee and begin to know. And again, the bottom line is it has to be tied to student outcomes and operational metrics that your leaders can be held accountable for. If you want people to make strategic decisions with their resources, they have to understand how to translate from the inputs to the outcomes that they're expected to produce. So, in balance, roughly the way that we do this is we worry about those details. We take your district ERP, we understand the complicated back ends and all that work, and we bring it down to the most basic components that are really critical. The general ledger and transaction journal, we translate that over in a way that is easy to access, easy to understand, and appealing to folks. And we do that on a nightly basis so you can get up-to-date information all the time from our system. And most importantly, we can connect that to school-level outcomes of all types directly into the operational data. You don't have to change the way things are structured, you don't have to change your systems, you don't have to change those accounting practices. You know, we spoke this morning about how accounting systems are at best, pretty good at the accounting part, right? They make sure that you know if you're going to overdraw. They'll put in the purchase order flow for you. You can have all these complicated approvals and all that stuff. They're decent at that. They'll cut the checks. But when we get to the analysis portion, when we get to the reporting, when we get to the access, when we get to making this human and understandable and easy to use, that's where they fall down, and that's the step that we take. So we make sure you don't have to change any of those processes, because those are a lot of work to build up. You don't have to change any of the way that your data is structured, because just like we don't want principals to be doing VLOOKUPs and left joins and SQL queries and all that stuff, you shouldn't have to either to support the work that we do. And we make it clean and easy to use. So instead of having to understand that code 4201 is regular salaries for teachers, you should just be able to start typing SA, and then you get a bunch of things that contain that showing up, like salaries and loss on sale, and who knew even that we have a separate line for salary for substitutes? Well, now I don't have to memorize the 500-page account book. I just start typing salaries, and I can start to see all the things related to it, and we're actually teaching you as you use the information to retrieve it. And that's what we do in our product. I'm going to kind of just quickly talk about what the 90-day plan looks like when we come in, and this is just sort of an example of how this is structured, and it leads directly into sort of how we make sure that we're providing the right supports and structures for principals and for department heads, grant managers, all the various folks who might interact with the system to, again, cut down the 3 years because we make the task itself a lot easier for folks. So we kick off when the server access is granted. Within 14 days, we've got the full configuration, data loaded, quality assurance check usually put in. Day 15, we get that quality sign off, and then we start with our webinar series, which runs roughly every 30 days for the first 3 to 6 months. And we start off with just basic information about education finance and finance in general. And we'll talk a little bit about how we found out that that was really the task we needed to do. And then we go live by day 20. And we start walking you through and ramping you up on those skill sets so that you can learn everything you need to know in order to analyze your budget, but also understand how that might attach to your student outcomes, and do it in a way that's quick and easy such that the expectation that principals can start to take charge of these things is not climbing Everest, right? At least we can get them up to base camp and get them some training and help them out and lay the groundwork so you're walking where other folks are taking steps and have that support.
So in continuing with the theme that most of our team has pretty diverse backgrounds, I actually started my career in corporate finance, interning at JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, and then working full-time at Citigroup. At Citigroup, I spent 6 years working on projects during the subprime crisis, during the start and the heart of it, and then spent my last 2 years there working in corporate mergers and acquisitions. So wanting to move into an area that would have more impact on the world, I transitioned into the world of education finance consulting, And there, one of the largest projects that I worked on was the implementation of student-based budgeting with Chicago Public Schools. And then 50% of my time about was spent working with some education entrepreneurs as they were developing really innovative school models, and we're looking for a financial plan to support that. So after a couple years of consulting, I actually was looking to have a more scalable impact, and that's what led me to Allovue. So in working on SBB at CPS, one of the things that stood out to me was this technology gap that existed. And if that was filled, it would really help support the adoption and sustainability of SBB. So if we contemplate the 4 key phases in SBB, in the planning phase, it would be critical to have technology available in order to help understand the steady state. So what's our baseline? Where does inadequacy or inequity exist today? In the analysis phase, it would really be quick to test weights out, scenarios, policies, just to see who would be affected the most and who would gain and lose the most under changes in the funding formula. And then we group deployment and support together because the common theme there is around the tools and training needed to help principals effectively manage their budgets throughout the year. So at Allovue, we like to say that we take a principal-centered learning approach, which we kind of borrowed from the instructional environment regarding student-centered learning. So we look to understand and identify the needs of principals and what their skill sets are. And we look at it in 4 key areas. So with technology, we look to understand, how do you use our platform? How are you able to discern information from it? And how can we help you in that regard? For finance, there's a couple of key categories that we look at. So first is around key terms and concepts in finance. So the what in your data. And then the second is around processes. So how are you making financial decisions to support your academic environment? We distinctly draw a line between data and finance because data is more broadly about the ability to navigate through information, such as the chart of accounts. Whereas finance is more about the tactical application of data to help support making monetary decisions. And then ultimately, once we build that foundational knowledge along those 3 categories, we can then move into the academic sphere. So in our work with districts and states, we've seen that oftentimes there can be pushback and apprehension around autonomy. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the skills and needs of principals remain largely undiagnosed. And so when we get into an engagement with any district or state, we issue the Savvy Survey. And with a Savvy Survey, we look to understand the skill set of our principals and central office staff, according to 3 main categories. So, what is your knowledge of basic finance concepts? Do you understand the difference between budget and actuals? Do you know what an encumbrance is, or what an outlier is? And for user experience, we look at your ability to glean information from a visualization. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is around understanding current behaviors. So how difficult is it for you today to access information? And what is the current amount of time you're spending accessing financial information? And what's that ideal state look like? So we have a couple of key findings so far in our analysis of survey responses. First is that overall, principals and central office staff overwhelmingly want more access to data, and that's just across the board. And then the second one is that 20% or more of survey respondents lack an understanding of some of these basic finance concepts. So that includes the difference between budget and actuals, and then it's actually greater than 30% that don't understand encumbrances or outliers. So one of the ways we look to fill that knowledge gap is through providing regular trainings throughout the year. So the first series, the 100s, is around how to use balance. So how do we bring you up to speed on the technology? And then also stepping back to review some of these basic finance concepts. Next, we look to accelerate that thinking and ask you to think more strategically. So now that you have these tools, how are you spending today? And how have you spent in the past? And how should that inform how you spend in the future? And then finally, we ask you to think big. So setting goals and then comparing yourself to other schools that have some best practices that you can leverage around the country. So another one of our interesting findings is that change is not easy, especially when a district has been doing things the same way for 20 or 30 years. But it has made their lives easier. So instead of having to memorize codes, you can now quickly filter by concepts, as Jason showed you earlier. So you don't need to know that 51,000, the object is teacher salaries. You can just look up your teacher salaries. And then oftentimes, it's kind of murky to figure out how dollars are being allocated directly to schools or central office departments. And so we look to create one consolidated view for locations, so that's pretty seamless. And then finally, as Jason also mentioned, we've seen a pattern of users calling the central office to find out information about their spending or their current budget, and now they can just quickly log in to view that information. So one of the key philosophies that we have at Allovue is that it's not just about developing this technology and popping in front of users. We're really looking for this behavioral shift, and that's how we measure success. So how are our users closely evaluating their financials and tying that into their academic environment? So just to give you some quick learnings from New Haven Public Schools, which is one of our pilot districts. When we initially approached developing a curriculum throughout the year, we thought that we first had to start with the technology. So we thought that was the biggest hurdle. Once we get everybody up to speed on the technology, then we could move into financial strategy, knowledge sharing, and then the happy world of academics and finance being connected. Yes.
At least for those of us up here.
Yes. What we now know is that we actually need to step back and spend more time on skills development. So it's not just about technology, but as you heard from the survey responses, we really need to spend time just bringing everyone up to speed on basic finance concepts before they can actually start to make those behavioral changes and start to think more strategically. Another interesting finding is that central office staff overwhelmingly say that schools aren't staying within their budget, and that's one of their biggest pain points. However, principals at schools are saying, I don't really know what's in my budget at any point in the year. I don't really understand the processes that are going on in my district, so I just have no clarity or control. And so it's just a really interesting dynamic for us to manage and navigate through as we see these differing opinions in terms of pain points that exist in the district. So on that kind of happy note, I'm going to turn it back over to Jess to wrap things up for us.
Some key takeaways for student-based budgeting in particular, but really financial management for districts across the board. You want to make sure that your school leaders have access to their data in a way that is quick, easy, and understandable. The word transparency gets thrown around a lot these days, but transparency doesn't just mean that it's available somewhere on the internet. It has to be in a format that's actually understandable to the people that have to make decisions from it. We also recommend using a diagnostic to assess where your decision makers currently are in terms of the skills, knowledge, and habits around financial management so that you can meet them where they are with professional development. You want to empower your school leaders with appropriate training, tools, and strategic support. In places that we've gone where student-based budgeting has had less than optimal outcomes, consistently we hear from the principals that they didn't feel supported, that they didn't feel trained, and that they really felt like they were set up to fail. You want to continually evaluate the quality of the analysis and training that you're doing with your school leaders so that you can adjust with them as they grow and as you grow as a district. And lastly, as you get towards the higher part of resource allocation mountain, you want to shift the role of the financial and central office away from those data collection and curation responsibilities and more towards facilitating conversations that link budgetary and spending decisions to student outcomes. At Allovue, we very much believe that there is a double bottom line in education. You certainly don't want to fall into a deficit, but more importantly, you want to make sure that student success is the bottom line for your district and your families and communities. So we would love to come visit you. We all try to spend as little time in our office as possible, much to the chagrin of my cat. And so we'd love to hear from you. And if you'd like to set up a time to visit with us more and see a demo of what Balance can do, you can email us at hello@allovue.com, and we'd love to set up a time to come meet with you.